My name is Doug, and I'm 58 years old. For 35 years, I worked as a factory supervisor at the Ford plant here in Detroit, building something I thought would last forever. I saved every penny I could, thinking about the future, thinking about family. I never imagined that the person I trusted most in this world would be the one to destroy everything I'd worked for. I never thought my own flesh and blood would look me in the eye, smile, and then steal my entire life savings without a second thought. Before I tell you what happened, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you believe family should mean something, and subscribe, because this story will show you how even the deepest wounds can heal when you fight back the right way. Now let me tell you about the day my world came crashing down. 3 years ago, I lost my Sarah to cancer. 32 years of marriage, and she was gone. The house felt empty, quiet in ways that made my chest ache. But I kept going because that's what you do. I kept showing up to the plant, kept doing my job, kept saving money like Sarah and I always planned. Over those decades of double shifts and overtime hours, we'd managed to put away $240,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was ours. Every dollar represented a missed dinner, a skipped vacation, a choice to work instead of rest. That money was supposed to be our retirement, our security, our legacy for our son, Marcus. Marcus is 32 now, my only child. When he was growing up, he was everything Sarah and I hoped for. Smart as a whip, charming enough to talk his way out of any trouble, and ambitious in ways that made me proud. He got his marketing degree, landed a good corporate job, married a nice girl named Amanda. For a while, everything seemed perfect. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect them. 2 years ago, Marcus lost his job in a corporate downsizing. The stress of unemployment ate away at his marriage until Amanda filed for divorce. The legal fees, the alimony, the cost of starting over it all added up fast. When Marcus called me last spring, his voice was different, strained, desperate. A father never stops being a father, no matter how old his children get. When Marcus asked if he could move back into the family home temporarily, just until he got back on his feet, I didn't hesitate. The house had been too quiet anyway. Having my son around again felt like getting a piece of my heart back. Those first few months were some of the best I'd had since Sarah passed. Marcus and I would sit on the back porch after dinner, talking about everything and nothing. We started going fishing on Saturday mornings, something we hadn't done since he was a teenager. We watched Detroit Lions games together, arguing about draft picks and coaching decisions like we used to. Marcus had big plans. He talked about starting his own digital marketing consultancy, about all the contacts he'd made over the years, about how companies were desperate for someone who understood social media and online advertising. The way he described it, it sounded like a gold mine waiting to be tapped. I found myself believing in him again, the way I had when he was 10 years old, and convinced he could build a rocket ship in the garage. Maybe that should have been my first warning sign. The idea came up gradually, the way these things always do. Marcus would mention needing startup capital, talk about missed opportunities because he didn't have the cash to move quickly enough. He'd show me articles about successful marketing agencies, point out how much money was being made in digital advertising. Then came the request that should have set off every alarm bell in my head. Marcus suggested I give him access to my bank accounts for business efficiency. He could handle the transfers, he said, make investments quickly when opportunities arose. It would streamline everything. I hesitated. 40 years of hard work had taught me to be careful with money, to think twice before making big decisions. But this wasn't some stranger asking for access to my life savings. This was my son, my flesh and blood, the boy I'd taught to ride a bike and helped with homework every night for 12 years. So I signed the papers. I gave him power of attorney over my financial accounts. Looking back now, I can see how naive that was, how trusting. But at the time, it felt like the natural thing to do. A father helping his son achieve his dreams. The first signs of trouble were small, easy to rationalize away. Large withdrawals that Marcus explained as equipment purchases, business registration fees, deposits for office space. When I questioned the amounts he'd show me, invoices, official-looking documents that seemed to justify every expense. But Marcus started changing. The son who used to wear jeans and old t-shirts around the house suddenly had expensive new clothes. Designer watches appeared on his wrist. His phone was always the latest model. When I asked about it, he'd laugh and say, image was everything in business, that clients needed to see success before they'd trust you with their marketing budget. My neighbor Harold, a retired banker who'd lived next door for 15 years, started dropping hints. He'd mentioned seeing Marcus coming home at odd hours, ask questions about the business that I couldn't answer. Harold had that banker's instinct for sensing when something wasn't quite right, but I dismissed his concerns as an old man's suspicion. The tension at home started building during family dinners. When I'd ask Marcus about client meetings or project deadlines, his answers became vague, defensive. He'd change the subject or leave the room entirely. The easy conversation we'd shared those first few months disappeared, replaced by awkward silences and careful small talk. Then Marcus brought home Jessica. She was everything Amanda hadn't been: flashy, demanding, expensive. She drove a sports car I knew Marcus couldn't afford, wore jewelry that caught the light from across the room. When I asked how they'd met, Marcus said she was a client who'd become something more. I started noticing Marcus wasn't actually going to the client meetings he claimed to attend. I'd see his car in the driveway when he was supposed to be across town in business meetings. When I confronted him about it, he had smooth explanations, stories about changed schedules and video conferences that sounded reasonable enough. The lies started piling up like autumn leaves. Fake business cards left casually on the kitchen counter. Staged phone calls that sounded like important negotiations, but felt rehearsed. Marcus was putting on a performance, and I was starting to see through the act. One evening, I used the family computer and discovered gambling websites in the browser history. Sports betting online casinos, poker games with buy-ins that made my stomach turn. When I asked Marcus about it, he claimed he was researching clients in the gaming industry. Another lie, another excuse, another reason for me to question everything I thought I knew about my son. I wanted to believe in him. I wanted to trust the boy I'd raised, the son Sarah and I had been so proud of. So I made a decision that haunts me to this day. I decided to give Marcus one more chance to believe his promises about paying everything back once the business took off. That decision cost me everything. The morning that changed my life forever started like any other. I drove to First National Bank for my monthly account review, something I'd done religiously for 20 years. Patricia, the branch manager, who'd handled my accounts since Sarah and I first opened them, usually greeted me with a warm smile and updates about her grandchildren. But that Tuesday morning, Patricia's expression was grave. She asked me to step into her office, closed the door behind us, and pulled up my account information on her computer screen. What I saw there made the room spin around me. My savings account showed a balance of $3,847. $236,000 had been transferred out over the past 6 months. Every transfer had been authorized using the power of attorney I'd given Marcus. Every withdrawal was legal, documented, and devastating. I sat there staring at the screen, my hands trembling as Patricia explained the details. Small transfers at first, a few thousand here and there, then larger amounts as Marcus grew bolder. The final withdrawal, just 3 days earlier, had cleaned out nearly everything that remained. Patricia's voice seemed to come from far away as she showed me the paperwork. Marcus's signature was on every authorization. The accounts had been drained methodically, professionally, completely. I don't remember driving home. I don't remember walking through the front door. But I remember the silence that greeted me, a silence that felt different from the usual quiet of an empty house. This was the silence of abandonment. Marcus was gone. Jessica was gone. They'd taken everything they could carry and vanished like smoke. Empty beer bottles littered the coffee table. Unpaid bills were scattered across the kitchen counter. Family photos lay torn and scattered on the living room floor, as if someone had tried to erase every trace of the memories we'd shared in that house. On the kitchen table, weighted down by an empty pizza box, was a note written in Marcus's familiar handwriting. "Dad, I had no choice. Business went bad. We'll pay you back someday. Don't try to find me." I fell to my knees right there in the kitchen. For the first time since Sarah's funeral, I cried. Deep, wrenching sobs that came from a place I'd kept locked away for 3 years. My son, my only child, had stolen everything I'd worked for and disappeared without even saying goodbye. I called his cell phone. The number was disconnected. I called his friends, his former co-workers, anyone who might know where he'd gone. No one had heard from him. It was as if Marcus had simply evaporated, taking my life savings with him. Mrs. Peterson from across the street eventually told me she'd seen a moving truck 3 days earlier. She'd assumed I knew about it, that maybe Marcus was finally moving into his own place. If only she'd known the truth. That night, I sat in Sarah's favorite chair and stared at the walls we'd painted together. The home we'd built together, the life we'd planned together. For the first time since she'd died, I understood why some people just give up. The weight of betrayal, especially betrayal by someone you love unconditionally, can crush you in ways that nothing else can. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just sat there and tried to figure out how my son, the boy I'd taught to throw a baseball and drive a car, had turned into someone capable of such cruelty. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of depression and despair. I barely ate, surviving on crackers and coffee. I stopped showering regularly, stopped caring about anything beyond the basic functions of staying alive. The phone rang constantly, but I didn't answer. Bills piled up on the kitchen table next to Marcus's note. When the utility bill arrived with a final notice stamp, reality hit me like a sledgehammer. The mortgage payment was due in 10 days. Without my savings, without any substantial income beyond my modest social security, I was facing foreclosure. At 58 years old, I was going to lose the home Sarah and I had built together. That's when social services called. Someone had made an anonymous tip about an elderly man in distress. The voice on the phone was kind but professional, asking questions about my well-being, my living situation, my ability to care for myself. Jennifer arrived the next morning. She was a social worker in her 30s, with gentle eyes and a clipboard full of forms. She sat in my living room, taking notes about my situation, asking careful questions about my mental state and financial resources. The conversation was humiliating. Here I was, a man who'd worked his entire adult life, reduced to explaining to a stranger half my age why I couldn't take care of myself anymore. Jennifer was kind about it, professional in her sympathy, but the shame burned in my chest like acid. She offered resources: food stamps, housing assistance, counseling services. All things designed to help people who'd fallen through the cracks, who'd lost everything through no fault of their own. But taking charity felt like admitting defeat, like acknowledging that I was exactly as helpless as Marcus had believed me to be. After Jennifer left, I sat alone in the quiet house and looked at Sarah's photograph on the mantel. She was smiling in that picture taken on our last wedding anniversary, before she got sick. She looked happy, confident, proud of the life we'd built together. Sarah wouldn't want this. She wouldn't want me to give up, to surrender, to let our son's betrayal define the rest of my life. She'd fought cancer for 2 years with more courage than I'd ever possessed. The least I could do was fight back against the person who had destroyed everything we'd worked for. That moment of clarity changed everything. I stopped being a victim and started being a survivor. I spent the next 3 days researching financial crimes, legal options, and investigative techniques. I learned about asset tracing, about how money laundering schemes work, about the legal definitions of elder abuse and financial fraud. I discovered that some of the transfers Marcus had made appeared to involve forged documents, signatures that didn't quite match the ones on file with the bank. I made an appointment with William Rodriguez, a criminal defense attorney who advertised experience with financial crimes. The initial consultation was devastating. William explained that civil suits could take years and cost more money than I had. Criminal charges would require proof of intent to defraud, evidence that might be difficult to obtain. Even if I won, getting my money back would depend on Marcus actually having assets to seize. But I also learned something important during that meeting. Marcus hadn't been as careful as he thought. Financial transactions leave trails, especially when they involve large amounts of money. If I could find out where Marcus had gone and what he was doing with my savings, I might be able to build a case that law enforcement would actually pursue. William's fee was more than I could afford, but he offered to work on a contingency basis if I could provide substantial evidence of criminal activity. That gave me hope, something I hadn't felt in weeks. I started my investigation that very afternoon. I called Marcus's former co-workers, his college friends, anyone who might have stayed in touch with him after the divorce. Most of them hadn't heard from him in months, but a few mentioned social media posts from Florida. I'd never been much for computers beyond basic email, but desperation is a powerful teacher. I spent hours learning how to search social media platforms, how to find public posts and photographs. What I discovered made my blood boil. Marcus was in Miami posting pictures of himself and Jessica at expensive restaurants on luxury boats in 5-star hotels. He was spending my life savings on a vacation lifestyle while I faced foreclosure and poverty. The posts showed him laughing, celebrating, living it up without a care in the world. But those posts also provided evidence. Timestamps, locations, receipts for expenses that could be traced back to the money stolen from my accounts. Marcus was creating a public record of his crimes, documenting every dollar he spent of my retirement savings. For the first time in weeks, I smiled. My son had always been too clever for his own good. This time, his arrogance was going to be his downfall. I approached the problem like I'd approached every challenge during my 35 years at the Ford plant. Break it down into manageable pieces. Gather the right tools. Follow a logical sequence of steps and execute the plan with precision. First, I reached out to my old contacts from the factory. Jerry from accounting had always been good with numbers and had connections in the financial industry. Tommy, the former union representative, knew how to investigate people who were trying to hide assets. These were men who'd fought for workers' rights for decades, and they understood the importance of holding people accountable for their actions. Jerry taught me about asset tracing techniques, how to follow money through business accounts and investment portfolios. Tommy showed me how to use public records databases to find business registrations, property ownership records, and court filings. Together, they helped me piece together what Marcus had done with my money. The investigation revealed something I hadn't expected. Marcus wasn't just spending my savings on a lavish lifestyle. He'd used a significant portion of the money as startup capital for a business venture in Miami, a luxury car rental service specializing in exotic sports cars and high-end vehicles. The company was registered under Jessica's name, but social media posts and business directory listings made it clear that Marcus was running the day-to-day operations. He was using my retirement savings to build his own company, creating wealth for himself from the money he'd stolen from his father. This discovery changed everything. Marcus wasn't just a son who'd made bad choices and stolen money to cover his debts. He was a calculating criminal who'd planned and executed a sophisticated financial crime using his own father's trust and love as weapons against him. I spent 2 weeks gathering evidence, business license records showing the registration of the car rental company, incorporation documents listing Jessica as the owner, but Marcus as the primary contact, social media posts showing Marcus at the business location advertising rental services and boasting about his success as an entrepreneur. The more I dug, the more crimes I uncovered. The business appeared to be operating without proper licensing in several jurisdictions. Insurance documents seemed to contain false information. Tax records were either missing or appeared to underreport income substantially. Marcus had made a critical error that many amateur criminals make. He'd gotten greedy and sloppy. Instead of keeping a low profile after stealing my money, he'd used it to build a highly visible business that left a trail of evidence pointing directly back to his crimes. I started documenting everything systematically. Screenshots of social media posts with timestamps and location data. Copies of business registration documents showing the dates of incorporation and startup capital sources. Bank records showing the transfers from my accounts to the business accounts. Phone records, email communications. Even Google Maps screenshots showing the business location. Within 2 weeks, I had assembled a case file that would have made the FBI proud. Every piece of evidence was dated, sourced, and cross-referenced with supporting documentation. I'd built an airtight case against my own son. But evidence was only part of the solution. I needed to get physically closer to Marcus and his operation if I was going to force him to face the consequences of his actions. I'd never been on an airplane since Sarah and I took our honeymoon trip to Niagara Falls 33 years earlier. But it was time to learn. I booked a flight to Miami using money I'd borrowed against my life insurance policy. It was a risk I couldn't afford, but it was also an investment in getting my life back. Harold agreed to keep an eye on the house while I was gone, and more importantly, he promised to call the police if Marcus showed up while I was away. The night before my flight, I sat in the living room and looked around at everything Sarah and I had built together. Tomorrow, I was going to confront the son who'd betrayed us both. I was going to look him in the eye and demand justice for what he'd done. For the first time in months, I felt like myself again. Not a victim, not a helpless old man, but a father who was going to hold his son accountable for his choices. Miami hit me like a wall of heat and humidity when I stepped off the plane. I'd never seen so many palm trees, so much bright sunshine, so many people who looked like they'd never worked a hard day in their lives. This was Marcus's world now, a place where appearance mattered more than substance, where my stolen retirement money could buy the illusion of success. I'd done my homework before making the trip. Marcus's car rental business operated out of a lot near South Beach, in a district full of luxury dealerships and high-end automotive services. I rented a modest sedan and drove through the area twice before parking across the street from his operation. The business was exactly what I'd expected from the social media posts: flashy, expensive, designed to impress tourists and wealthy clients who wanted to drive exotic cars during their Miami vacation. Ferrari, Lamborghini, McLaren vehicles worth more than most people's houses lined up like trophies in the Florida sunshine. And there, in the middle of it all, was my son. Marcus looked different than he had 6 months earlier. Tanned, fit, wearing clothes that cost more than I used to make in a week. He moved through the lot like he owned the world, talking to customers, directing employees, playing the part of a successful entrepreneur. I spent the entire first day watching from a distance, documenting his operation, taking photographs and videos that would serve as evidence. I saw him handle transactions worth thousands of dollars, watched him negotiate deals with customers who paid cash for week-long rentals of $250,000 automobiles. Every dollar flowing through that business had started in my savings account. Every car on that lot represented years of my labor, decades of sacrifice, a lifetime of careful financial planning that had been stolen and transformed into someone else's success story. But I also noticed things that Marcus probably thought no one would see. The business wasn't just questionable, it was actively criminal. I watched him rent cars to customers who clearly didn't have proper licenses or insurance. I saw cash transactions that were obviously designed to avoid reporting requirements. I documented safety violations, regulatory violations, and what appeared to be systematic tax fraud. Marcus had built his dream business on a foundation of crime, using my stolen money to fund an operation that was breaking laws in multiple jurisdictions. He'd graduated from family betrayal to organized criminal activity. On the second day, I walked directly onto the lot. Marcus was showing a red Ferrari to a young couple who looked like they had more money than sense. He was explaining the features, the performance specifications, the rental terms that would let them live like millionaires for the weekend. When he turned around and saw me standing there, the blood drained from his face. "Hello, son." The words came out calmly, quietly, with none of the anger I'd been carrying for months. Marcus stared at me like I was a ghost, like a nightmare that had followed him across the country to destroy his new life. "Dad? What? How did you find you?" I finished the question for him. "You posted your location on social media, Marcus. You documented every crime you committed with my money. You made this investigation easier than it should have been." The young couple sensed the tension and quickly excused themselves. Marcus's employees suddenly found reasons to be busy elsewhere in the lot. Within minutes, we were alone among the stolen cars that represented my stolen future. Marcus tried to regain his composure, to slip back into the charming persona he'd perfected over the years. But I could see the panic in his eyes, the recognition that his carefully constructed new life was about to collapse. "Dad, I can explain everything. The business is doing great. I'm making real money now. I can start paying you back with interest, just like I always planned." $236,000, I said quietly. "That's what you stole from me, Marcus. Not borrowed, not invested, stolen. You forged documents, you lied about business expenses, and you abandoned me to face foreclosure and poverty." Marcus's defensive anger flared up, the same entitled rage I'd seen glimpses of during his last weeks at home. You would have just wasted it anyway, Dad. Sitting in that house feeling sorry for yourself, letting the money rot in some savings account. At least I'm building something, creating value, making it grow. That's when I knew for certain that my son was truly lost. Not just morally confused or temporarily selfish, but fundamentally broken in ways that might never be repaired. He genuinely believed that stealing from his father was justified because he could use the money more effectively. I reached into my jacket and pulled out a manila envelope containing copies of all the evidence I'd gathered. Bank records, business documents, social media screenshots, photographs I'd taken over the past 2 days. Marcus, you have 2 choices. You can return every penny you stole, shut down this criminal operation, and accept the legal consequences of your actions. Or you can continue pretending that you're the victim here, and I'll hand this evidence over to the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. Marcus laughed. Actually laughed. You're just an old man with no power, Dad. You can't touch me. I'm successful now. I have lawyers. I have resources you don't understand. Go ahead and call whoever you want. By the time they figure out what happened, I'll be in a country that doesn't have extradition treaties. That's when I smiled. For the first time in our conversation, I smiled. I already called them Marcus 3 days ago. This evidence package was delivered to the Miami-Dade prosecutor's office yesterday morning. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit confirmed receipt this morning. I showed him my phone, displaying text message confirmations from law enforcement agencies, email receipts for evidence, submissions, case number assignments that proved I wasn't bluffing. Marcus's arrogance evaporated instantly. His face went white, then red, then white again, as the reality of his situation sank in. You wouldn't actually send your own son to prison. You already sent yourself to prison, Marcus. I'm just making sure the paperwork gets filed correctly. That's when Jessica appeared from the office building. She'd been listening from inside, and she'd heard enough to understand which way the wind was blowing. In less than 5 minutes, she offered to testify against Marcus in exchange for immunity from prosecution. She provided passwords to business accounts, revealed the locations of hidden assets, and handed over financial records that Marcus thought he'd kept secret. The business partners who'd seemed so loyal the day before suddenly had urgent appointments elsewhere. The employees who'd looked up to Marcus as their successful boss started updating their resumes. The customers who'd admired his entrepreneurial success began demanding refunds for deposits they'd made on future rentals. Marcus's empire collapsed in real time, and I watched every moment of it. Within 6 hours, he'd signed an agreement to return the stolen money, close the fraudulent business, and perform 500 hours of community service. The first payment, $50,000 from the business account closure, was transferred back to my bank that afternoon. I stood there watching my son's face as his confidence turned to fear. His arrogance turned to desperation. His certainty turned to the recognition that actions have consequences, even for people who think they're too clever to get caught. The flight back to Detroit felt different than the trip to Miami. I wasn't carrying the weight of uncertainty anymore. Wasn't consumed by the helpless rage that had poisoned my life for months. Justice had been served, and while the emotional wounds would take time to heal, the practical problems were finally being resolved. Over the next 18 months, Marcus made payments totaling $218,000. It wasn't everything he'd stolen, but it was enough to save my house, restore my financial security, and give me back the dignity that comes from being able to take care of yourself. The community service requirement connected Marcus with organizations that helped elder abuse victims. For the first time in his adult life, he was forced to see the real consequences of financial crimes against older adults. He met people whose children had stolen their medication money, whose caregivers had emptied their accounts, whose trust had been violated by the people who were supposed to protect them. I started volunteering with one of those same organizations. My experience with Marcus had taught me how easy it is for family members to exploit the people who love them most, and I wanted to help other seniors avoid the same devastation I'd experienced. Speaking to groups about financial protection and family boundary setting became a new purpose for me. I shared my story at senior centers, community organizations, and church groups throughout the Detroit area. The response was overwhelming. Dozens of people approached me after each presentation to share their own stories of family financial abuse, and many of them found the courage to take action because they'd heard about my success in fighting back. The local newspaper ran an article about my advocacy work, which led to speaking engagements at universities, law enforcement training seminars, and conferences for social workers who deal with elder abuse cases. I discovered that my experience, as painful as it had been, could serve as a roadmap for other people who found themselves in similar situations. Marcus and I started having supervised visits after 6 months. The charming, manipulative son I'd known was gone, replaced by someone who seemed genuinely remorseful for the pain he'd caused. The legal consequences, the community service work, and the loss of everything he'd built in Miami had forced him to confront the reality of what he'd done to his family. Our relationship would never be the same. Trust once broken so completely doesn't simply regenerate because someone says they're sorry. But I learned to separate love from enabling to support my son's efforts to rebuild his life without making myself vulnerable to future exploitation. I established new boundaries that protected my financial independence while leaving room for a relationship based on mutual respect rather than unlimited access to my resources. Marcus understood that future contact would depend on transparency, accountability, and demonstrated change over time rather than promises and good intentions. During one of our conversations, I told Marcus about visiting his mother's grave the week after I returned from Miami. I'd sat there in the quiet cemetery and told Sarah that I'd fought back, that I'd held our son accountable for his choices, that I'd refused to let his betrayal define the rest of my life. I think she would have been proud of the man I'd become through that struggle. Not bitter or vengeful, but stronger and more purposeful than I'd been since she died. The experience had taught me that surviving loss isn't about avoiding pain, but about finding meaning in the process of healing. My work with elder abuse prevention continues today. Every month, I receive letters from people who attended my presentations, thanking me for giving them the courage to confront family members who were exploiting them financially. Some of those stories have happy endings, with families learning to rebuild trust and respect. Others end with permanent separations that were necessary for survival and dignity. The house feels different now, not empty and sad like it did after Sarah died, and not tense and suspicious like it did when Marcus was stealing from me. It feels peaceful, like a place where an older man can live with confidence and purpose, where the past informs the present without controlling it. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and healing doesn't require pretending that devastating betrayals never happened. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is refusing to enable their worst choices, even when that person is your own child. Love your family, but remember that trust is earned through consistent actions over time, not inherited through blood relationships. The people who truly care about you will respect your boundaries, support your independence, and value your well-being as much as their own desires. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is say no to someone you love, especially when saying yes would enable them to harm themselves and others. That lesson cost me nearly everything I'd worked for, but it also taught me who I really am when everything else is stripped away. I'm Doug. I'm 60 years old now, and I'm stronger than I ever imagined I could be. If you're facing something similar, if someone you trust is taking advantage of your love and generosity, remember that you have more power than you think. You deserve respect, safety, and dignity, regardless of what anyone else believes they're entitled to take from you. Have you ever had to set difficult boundaries with family members who weren't treating you with respect? Let me know in the comments below. If this story helped you think about your own situation differently, please like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming life's biggest challenges and finding strength you didn't know you had. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that your worth isn't determined by how others treat you, but by how you choose to respond when they treat you badly. Take care of yourselves, protect what you've worked for, and never give up on the possibility of justice, even when it seems impossible to achieve.